All right, welcome back everyone for your daily dose of UPSC Current Affairs. It's March 10th, 2025, and we've got a lot to unpack in this first part of our deep dive.
A lot to cover indeed.
Remember, some of these topics you might have heard in previous episodes, but that's actually great. Think of it as a little revision to really make sure you've got the info locked in.
Repetition is key for UPSC, right?
Absolutely. So, today we're going to be jumping into a whole bunch of different areas, things that are super important for your prep. We're talking international organizations like the IPCC.
Pressing health concerns, things like hantavirus.
Oh, and even infrastructure projects that, people are really debating about.
We'll also be looking at, some fascinating environmental news and a bit of international relations with the Loss and Damage Fund.
Okay, so let's get started. And you know what? Let's kick things off with something that's always relevant for the UPSC. I'm talking about the IPCC. Now remember, for those who, need a little refresher, the IPCC, it's that UN body that assesses all the science related to climate change. And what's interesting about them, they don't actually do their own research.
Right.
They take thousands of studies and they synthesize it all. They bring it all together to give us, the big picture.
Yeah. It's like having, I guess you could call it a cheat sheet. It's a way to understand, one of the most complex issues that our world is facing.
Yeah, a cheat sheet to save the planet. So speaking of comprehensive and, big picture, they've actually just begun their 7th assessment report cycle.
That's right.
That's huge, I mean, think about it. Their reports, they inform global climate policy. So this new cycle, this could actually have massive implications for international agreements, for national action plans.
Absolutely. And just like you would break down a big project into smaller tasks, the IPCC, they do something similar. They divide their work into 3, what they call working groups. So working group 1, they tackle the physical science basis of climate change. So, what's happening and why. Working group 2 focuses on the impacts, vulnerabilities and what we can do about it.
Adaptation.
Exactly, adaptation.
Okay. And working group 3?
They explore mitigation. So, what can we actually do to reduce emissions, to really limit climate change?
So they're the ones coming up with the solutions, right?
Trying to.
All right. And just, for those who are taking notes, everyone should be, remember the IPCC headquarters are in Geneva, Switzerland. And when it comes to their funding, well, that comes from the World Meteorological Organization, the UN Environment Program, and also contributions from member countries.
That's right.
Okay, so that's the IPCC. Definitely a crucial organization for anyone who's following climate change, international policy. It's all connected. Now, let's switch gears a little bit, and let's talk about a health topic that's been making headlines. And this is Hantavirus Pulmonary Syndrome. We call it HPS for short. And sadly, it recently claimed the life of Betsy Arakawa, the wife of Oscar-winning actor Gene Hackman. So, it's a tragic reminder that even these kind of rare diseases, they can really have a huge impact.
Yeah, it really is a reminder. And HPS, it initially presents with, symptoms that might seem like the flu. So you're thinking fever, fatigue, muscle aches, things like that. But then it can, and it does, very rapidly progress to severe respiratory distress.
So it sounds scary, but what causes it? How do people get this?
Right. Well, the key here, and this is important, especially for, our listeners, it's spread primarily through contact with rodents.
Rodents, wow.
Yeah. And specifically their droppings, their urine, their saliva. So this is where, environmental hygiene comes into play, rodent control, these are all essential.
So it's not just about, keeping your house clean, but thinking about the bigger picture, the environment.
Yeah, absolutely. And what makes it even more, I guess you could say, challenging is there's no specific treatment for HPS. And the incubation period, it can range from a little over a week to even a month.
Wow, so it's hard to even know you have it.
Exactly. Early detection is tricky. And that's why prevention is absolutely crucial here.
Okay, good to know. All right, let's travel now. We're going all the way to the northeast of India, to a beautiful place called Dehing Patkai National Park.
Right.
It's in Assam. And you know what? They often call this the Amazon of the East.
I can see why.
Because, you've got such incredible biodiversity in the dense rainforest. And it was actually recently upgraded from a wildlife sanctuary to a national park.
Yeah. And that happened actually relatively recently, December of 2020.
So see, this is how, current events can tie into your static GK. Gotta love it.
Absolutely.
And this park, it's really a treasure trove of unique species. And we're talking tigers, elephants,
Even the clouded leopard, which was recently sighted there.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah.
Okay, so, we talked about the clouded leopard, but there's another important sort of creature we have to mention, the Dehing River.
Right.
It's a tributary of the mighty Brahmaputra, and it flows right through this park.
Wow.
But Dehing Patkai, it's not just about the plants and animals. It's also home to so many different indigenous communities, so we have that sociocultural dimension to this incredible ecological hotspot.
Right. And, that interconnectedness, that's something that UPSC loves to ask about. So definitely take note of these connections, guys.
Oh, that's good advice.
Yeah.
Okay, next up, let's talk about a major infrastructure project that's been making some waves and causing a bit of a stir. We're talking about the Sharavathi Pumped Storage Hydroelectric Project.
Interesting.
It's in Karnataka.
Yeah.
And it's going to be huge, ambitious, designed to be the largest of its kind in India. The planned capacity, 2,000 millidew.
Wow.
Now, think of it like a massive energy storage system, like a giant battery. So basically, during periods where we don't need so much electricity, right, low demand, they're going to pump water uphill to a higher reservoir, using that extra power from the grid. And then when we need it, when demand peaks, they release the water downhill, it spins turbines, and boom, we get electricity.
It's like storing energy for when you really need it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But here's where things get, a little interesting, a little tricky, because there is some pushback. Environmentalists are raising some concerns.
Of course.
Yeah, they're worried about, the impact this could have on the ecosystem, especially in a sensitive place like the Western Ghats.
Right, the Western Ghats, huge biodiversity hotspot.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the Sharavathi River itself, it's a vital source of hydropower for Karnataka already.
Yeah.
And it supports, a lot of biodiversity. So you can see why there's some tension here.
And I think this is so important for anyone who's preparing for the civil services. Balancing those developmental needs with environmental concerns, that's a constant challenge. And, the UPSC, they want you to be able to analyze this.
You got to think critically, right?
Absolutely. So the Sharavathi project, it's a prime example of this dilemma, something we're thinking about for sure. What do you think, listeners? Where do you stand on this one?
Okay, let's take to the skies now with an incredible creature, the bar-headed goose.
One of my favorites.
It's one of the world's highest flying birds, and it's famous for its migrations over the Himalayas, soaring over those peaks at unbelievable altitudes.
Can you imagine 25,000 feet? They're facing such incredibly challenging conditions. Low oxygen, freezing temperatures.
It's incredible.
And yet they do it. They navigate these obstacles with such resilience. And guess what? One was actually spotted in Arunachal Pradesh recently.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Another great example of how current events tie into the natural world and, of course, to your UPSC syllabus.
Always got to keep that in mind.
Okay, so they breed in Central Asia, and then they migrate to different parts of South Asia, including India, during the winter. And just a quick note, for those who, like to get those details right, their scientific name, it's Anser indicus.
That's a good one to remember.
Yeah, and they're pretty adaptable when it comes to where they spend the winter. You can find them near freshwater lakes, rivers, even farmland. But when it's breeding season, they head back to those high-altitude lakes.
They know where they need to be.
That's for sure. And the good news is, right now, they're classified as least concern on the IUCN Red List. But that doesn't mean, we can just relax and forget about conservation. All right, let's turn our attention now to international relations and a topic that's been, generating quite a bit of discussion, the Loss and Damage Fund. Now, this isn't about, losing your wallet or anything like that.
No, nothing like that.
This is about, the economic and the non-economic losses that developing countries face because of climate change.
Right. Impacts that they often have very little control over.
Yeah, and this fund, it was actually established at COP27 in Egypt last year.
Yeah.
And the goal, it's to provide financial support to these nations that are, let's be honest, on the front lines of climate change.
Yeah, they're the ones who are often hit the hardest, unfortunately.
So we're talking, rising sea levels, extreme heat waves, devastating cyclones, all these things that can cause so much damage and displacement.
And, it really is a matter of justice, isn't it?
That's the whole point, climate justice.
Yeah.
And here's where things get a little complicated. The U.S. recently withdrew from the fund. And, a lot of people are seeing this as a major blow to those climate justice efforts.
Yeah, it's definitely a setback.
It is. And, if we go back to the Paris Agreement, it clearly calls for developed nations to assist developing nations in coping with the impacts of climate change. But even with this fund, the pledges, they just don't seem to be enough.
Yeah, it really begs the question, how effective can any of these initiatives be without, the financial backing, especially from the major players?
So, something to think about, right? It's complex.
Yeah.
What do you think, listeners? Is the loss and damage fund a step in the right direction, or is it, maybe just another empty promise? It's something to ponder.
It is, and it's this kind of critical thinking, that's going to set you apart in the UPSC exam.
All right, let's dive deep now, all the way down to the ocean, to the Atacama Trench.
One of the deepest parts of the ocean.
Absolutely. And you know what? Scientists, they've actually discovered a new deep-sea predator down there.
Fascinating.
It is. And it's called, get ready for this, Dulcibella camanchaca.
Try saying that 3 times fast.
I know, right?
It's a mouthful.
So you might be thinking, okay, what's the big deal? It's a tiny, kind of shrimp-like creature. But what's special about this one, it's the first predatory amphipod that they've found in the Hadal Zone.
Which is, the deepest part of the ocean. We're talking below 6,000 meters.
So most amphipods down there, they're just scavengers. They just eat whatever floats down.
Right, just surviving on scraps.
This little guy, he's a hunter. He evolved to become a predator in one of the most extreme environments on Earth.
It makes you wonder what else is down there.
Right. And the name, I just love it. Dulcibella camanchaca.
So unique.
It is. And, Dulcibella is actually inspired by a character from the novel Don Quixote. And camanchaca, that actually means darkness in some South American languages. So it's very fitting.
It is. A creature of the deep darkness.
Okay, let's move on now from the ocean depths to something a little closer to home and unfortunately not as exciting.
Okay.
We're talking Ponzi schemes. And you might think, oh, those are things of the past, but unfortunately that's not true.
Yeah, the Enforcement Directorate in India, they just seized a business jet in Hyderabad. It was part of an investigation into, get this, an 850 crore rupee Ponzi scheme.
That's a lot of money. So it's a big reminder that, these scams are still out there. So let's break it down for our listeners. What exactly is a Ponzi scheme?
Okay, so in the simplest terms, it's basically a fraudulent investment operation. And what happens is returns are paid to those who are already invested, using money from new investors. So it creates this illusion of, high profits with very little risk.
But that can't last forever, right?
Right. It's like a house of cards. Eventually collapses because you just run out of new investors. And the name, it actually comes from Charles Ponzi, a swindler who, became infamous back in the 1920s for running one of these schemes.
And unfortunately, India has seen its share of Ponzi scams.
Oh, absolutely.
We have, the Sarada scam, the Rose Valley scam, Speak Asia. These are all big reminders of how, damaging these schemes can be.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that, in India, they are illegal.
Right.
We have the Prize Chit and Money Circulation Banning Act of 1978 and the Unregulated Deposit Schemes Act of 2019.
So there are safeguards in place.
There are, but awareness is still key.
Okay. Good point. All right. For our final topic in this segment, we're going to turn our attention to international law and a recent development that's caused some debate. Lithuania's withdrawal from the Convention on Cluster Munitions.
Oh, right. This has drawn quite a bit of criticism, especially from human rights groups.
Yeah. So this convention, it came into effect back in 2010, and what it does is it prohibits the use, the production, the transfer, the stockpiling of cluster munitions.
So essentially trying to get rid of them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And for those who might not know, what are cluster munitions? Why are people so concerned about them? Well, imagine a bomb that releases dozens or even hundreds of smaller bomblets over a wide area.
So it's not just one explosion, it's many.
And the problem is that a lot of these bomblets, they don't explode on impact. They become like landmines.
Right, and they can remain dangerous for years, decades even.
And so you have this threat to civilians long after a conflict is over.
It's indiscriminate, it's long-lasting, and that's why this convention exists. It's trying to protect civilians.
But here's the interesting thing. Major powers like the U.S., Russia, China, and India, they're not part of this convention.
It's a tricky situation. They argue that, cluster munitions, they have their uses in the military, and that their stockpiles are necessary for national security.
So it brings up a really difficult question, right? How do you balance the need for military effectiveness with, this humanitarian imperative to protect civilians?
Right. That's the dilemma. There are no easy answers.
No. And it's something to keep in mind, as you're thinking about international law. armed conflict, and the ethics involved.
Absolutely. It's all connected.
All right, for our last topic today, let's talk about something a bit closer to home, the Indian Army's T-72 tanks.
Oh, a classic.
Yeah, they're a mainstay of the Indian Army. And the Ministry of Defense, they just signed a contract to upgrade the engines on these tanks. And this is all about, enhancing their performance, keeping them battle ready.
So basically giving them a boost.
Yeah, like a power boost for these workhorses. The T-72s, they're going to be getting 1,000 horsepower engines. That's a big upgrade from their current 780 horsepower engine.
A significant improvement.
This is important for, UPSC prep. This isn't just about importing new tanks. The T-72s, they're manufactured and upgraded right here in India at the Heavy Vehicles Factory in Avadi.
Right. It shows India's, increasing self-reliance when it comes to defense.
Yeah. And it's important to remember, the T-72, it's a tough tank. It's known for its armor. It's got that powerful 125 millimeter smoothbore gun, and it's very maneuverable. So with these new engines, they'll be even more effective.
Oh, absolutely.
So for all you UPSC aspirants out there, keep up with these developments in India's defense capabilities, because they often pop up in those current affairs questions.
They do. Always good to be prepared.
Okay, let's talk about another creature, a fascinating one, the bar-headed goose.
Oh, those incredible high flyers.
One of the world's highest flying birds, famous for their migrations over the Himalayas. Imagine flying at altitudes of up to 25,000 feet.
Yeah, it's hard to even comprehend. Navigating those conditions, the low oxygen, the freezing temperatures. It's incredible.
Their resilience is amazing. And guess what? One was recently spotted in Arunachal Pradesh.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it just shows, how these natural events can tie into current events in India.
Always making those connections.
So their breeding grounds are in Central Asia. And then during the winter, they migrate to different parts of South Asia, including India.
And they're quite flexible when it comes to their winter habitat. You can find them near freshwater lakes, rivers, even farmlands.
Right. But then when breeding season comes around, it's back to those high-altitude lakes in Central Asia. Oh, and for those who like the specifics, their scientific name is Anser indicus.
Good one to remember.
And on a positive note, they're currently classified as least concern on the IUCN Red List. But, that doesn't mean we can just forget about their conservation.
Of course not. Every species is important.
All right, let's shift gears now to a topic that's been generating a lot of discussion in international relations, the Loss and Damage Fund. It's all about climate justice. It's about providing financial support to developing countries that are, really facing the brunt of climate change impacts.
Right. It's recognizing that they're often disproportionately affected, even though they might have contributed less to the problem.
Exactly. This fund was actually established at a COP27 in Egypt just last year. And the goal is, to help these nations cope with the impacts of climate change and to build resilience. So, think about things like rising sea levels, extreme weather events, prolonged droughts.
All those events that can cause, immense economic losses, but also, non-economic losses, things that are harder to measure.
Right, like cultural heritage, biodiversity, these are all incredibly valuable.
Exactly, and you can't put a price tag on those.
Okay, so the idea is good, right? Helping those who are most vulnerable. But there have been some challenges, some controversies. The U.S. recently withdrew from the fund.
Yeah, and that drew a lot of criticism from climate activists, from world leaders.
Understandably. So it raises these questions, right? Is there really commitment from developed nations to address this issue of climate justice? And who should really bear the cost of addressing climate change impacts?
It's a complicated question, and even with this fund, the current pledges, they just don't seem to be enough.
Yeah, we're not quite there yet. And if you think back to the Paris Agreement, it calls for developed nations to help developing nations cope with climate change. But the reality is the funding still falls short. So it's a complex issue with, implications for global climate action, for international relations, for everything.
Absolutely.
So for all our UPSC aspirants listening, this is definitely a topic to dive deeper into. Think about the arguments from both sides, the historical context of climate negotiations, the potential impact. It's all connected.
And remember, developing that nuanced understanding, that's what's going to be key for those essay questions, for those interviews. That's what's going to set you apart.
Okay, so we've talked about some pretty serious topics. Maybe we can lighten things up a bit. What about that bar-headed goose we mentioned earlier? Those high-flying birds. Remember?
Oh yeah, the ones that migrate over the Himalayas.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're amazing, aren't they? Imagine flying at like 25,000 feet.
It's incredible, navigating that Low oxygen, those freezing temperatures, I mean, they're tough.
Really tough. And guess what? One was recently spotted in Arunachal Pradesh.
Oh, really? That's cool.
It is. It's like, it just shows how these natural events, they tie into, current events in India. It's all connected.
It is. Always good to see those connections, for sure.
So they breed in Central Asia, and then during the winter, they migrate to different parts of South Asia, India being one of them. And they're actually pretty adaptable when it comes to their winter habitat. They're not too picky. You can find them near freshwater lakes, rivers, even farmland.
Right. As long as there's food, I guess. But then when breeding season rolls around, it's back to those high-altitude lakes in Central Asia.
Right, back to the breeding grounds.
And just for those who like the details, their scientific name is Anser indicus. Always good to know, right?
Definitely, especially for the UPSC.
Oh, absolutely. And thankfully, they're currently classified as least concern on the IUCN Red List. But that doesn't mean, we can just ignore conservation efforts.
Of course not. Conservation is always important, no matter the species.
All right, let's turn our attention now to a topic that's been generating a lot of buzz in international relations, the Loss and Damage Fund. And this is a big one for climate justice. It's all about, providing financial support to those developing countries that are hit hardest by climate change.
Right. Recognizing that, they often bear the brunt of the impacts, even though they might have contributed less to the problem in the first place.
Exactly. And this fund, it was actually established at the COP27 in Egypt.
Yeah.
Last year. The goal, is to help these countries cope with the impacts and also to build resilience for the future. So we're talking, things like rising sea levels, extreme weather events, those prolonged droughts, the kind of things that cause, a lot of damage.
Immense damage, both economic and non-economic.
Right. It's not just about money. Think about, cultural heritage, loss of biodiversity. Those are things that you can't really put a price tag on.
Exactly. They're invaluable.
Okay, so the idea behind the fund is good, right? Helping those who are most vulnerable. But, it hasn't been all smooth sailing. The U.S., they actually withdrew from the fund recently.
Yeah. And that was a big deal. A lot of people saw that as a step back, a lack of commitment from developed nations.
Yeah. It raises those tough questions about, who should really bear the cost of addressing climate change? And is there really a genuine effort to achieve climate justice?
It's a complex issue, for sure.
It is. And, even with this fund, the pledges, they just don't seem to be enough.
Right. There's still a gap between, what's needed and what's being promised.
And, if you think back to the Paris Agreement, it clearly states that developed nations should help developing nations cope with climate change. But the reality is, the funding, it still falls short.
Yeah, it's a work in progress, I guess you could say.
It is, and it's something that has these huge implications for everything, really. Global climate action, international relations, even national policy.
Absolutely. It's all interconnected.
So for all our UPSC aspirants out there, this is a topic that's definitely worth exploring in more depth. Think about the arguments from both sides, the historical context, the potential impact. It's a complex issue, but understanding these nuances is really what's going to make you stand out.
Exactly. It's about developing that critical thinking, that ability to see the bigger picture. And that's what the UPSC is all about.
All right, now let's dive into something completely different. We're going to head all the way down to the Atacama Trench, one of the deepest points on Earth.
Oh, wow. What's going on down there? It's pretty amazing what they find down there. Scientists, they've discovered a new species.
Oh, wow. What is it?
It's called Dulcibella camanchaca.
Dulcibella what?
Camanchaca. It's a mouthful, I know.
It is. So what is it? Some kind of giant squid or something?
Not quite. It's an amphipod.
An amphipod. Okay. Remind me what those are again?
Think tiny, like a shrimp. And usually they're scavengers, especially down in the deepest parts of the ocean. That Hadal zone where this one was found. But this little guy, is a predator.
Wow. A predator in the deepest part of the ocean? That's incredible. So how did they even find it?
Well, technology has advanced so much that scientists can send these really sophisticated, remotely operated vehicles down to these depths, and they can explore and collect samples and, take video footage. It's pretty amazing.
It is. And the name, Dulcibella camanchaca, it's pretty unique.
Yeah, it is. And you know what? It actually has a literary connection. Dulcibella, that part of the name, it's inspired by a character from Don Quixote.
Oh, wow. I would never have guessed that.
And then camanchaca, that actually means darkness in some South American languages.
So it's like a creature of the deep darkness. Very fitting.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about climate change, we've talked about the deep ocean, but let's come back down to Earth now.
Right.
And unfortunately, to a topic that's not as exciting, but definitely important, we're talking Ponzi schemes.
Right. And it's, something that people might think is a thing of the past, but it's not.
Yeah, those scams, they're still out there.
Oh, absolutely. And the Enforcement Directorate in India, they actually seized a business jet in Hyderabad recently.
Really?
Yeah, and it was all part of an investigation into a massive Ponzi scheme. We're talking 850 crore rupees.
That's a huge amount of money.
Yeah.
So it just shows, these scams, they can be incredibly sophisticated.
They are. And, for our listeners who might not be familiar with this term, a Ponzi scheme, it's basically a fraudulent investment operation.
Right. So how do they work?
Well, returns are paid to existing investors using the money from new investors.
So it's like a pyramid scheme almost.
Kind of, yeah. It creates this illusion of high profits with low risk, which, obviously attracts people. But, eventually it all collapses because you just run out of new investors to keep the money flowing.
Mm-hmm.
And the name, it actually comes from Charles Ponzi.
Oh, right. The infamous swindler from the 1920s.
That's the one. And unfortunately, India, it has seen its fair share of these Ponzi schemes.
Oh, absolutely. We've had, the Sarada scam, the Rose Valley scam, so many others.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that, even though there are safeguards in place, these things can still happen.
Exactly. Awareness is so important. You really have to do your research, be cautious. If something sounds too good to be true, it probably is.
Okay, now for our final topic today, we're going to turn our attention to international law, and specifically to Lithuania's withdrawal from the Convention on Cluster Munitions.
Right. Now, this has been quite controversial.
It has, and for good reason. So this convention, it came into effect back in 2010. And what it does is it bans the use, production, transfer, stockpiling of cluster munitions.
Essentially trying to eliminate them.
Right. And for those who might not know, what are cluster munitions? Well, imagine a bomb that releases dozens, even hundreds of smaller bomblets over a large area. And the problem is a lot of these bomblets, they don't explode right away.
They become like little landmines scattered everywhere.
They can be a threat to civilians for years, for decades even, long after a conflict is over.
It's a huge humanitarian concern. And that's why this convention is so important. It's trying to protect innocent lives.
So it seems like a no-brainer, right? Why wouldn't every country sign on to this? But here's the thing. Major powers like the U.S., Russia, China, India, they haven't.
Right. And their argument is that cluster munitions, they do have legitimate military uses and that they need them for national security.
So it's that tension again, right? Between military needs and humanitarian concerns.
Exactly. And, there are no easy answers. It's a complex issue. But it's important to understand the arguments from both sides and to think critically about these things.
Absolutely. Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive for today. We've covered a lot of ground. We've talked about everything from climate change and the deep ocean to financial scams and international law. It just goes to show, how interconnected everything is and how important it is to stay informed, to be aware of what's happening in the world around us.
And to think critically, to analyze, to connect the dots. That's what's going to make you a successful UPSC aspirant.
That's right. So we hope you enjoyed this deep dive. And remember, this was just part 3. Make sure you catch the other parts for even more insights and analysis. And until then, keep those minds sharp, stay curious, and keep diving deep into the world of current affairs.
We'll see you in the next one.
And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this deep dive with your fellow UPSC aspirants. Until next time.